Sarah Williams had been a nurse for 8 years, long enough to know that the worst decisions aren't made in emergencies. They're made in the quiet moments, when you have time to think, time to weigh consequences, time to realize that every choice will hurt someone. Tonight, standing in the dimmed hallway of Memorial Hospital's third floor at 2:47 a.m., Sarah faced a choice that would force her to decide what matters more, the rules that keep the system running or the lives that fall through its cracks.
Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing.
The fluorescent lights in the third-floor hallway hummed with their usual monotonous frequency, a sound Sarah had long since stopped noticing consciously, but that lived somewhere in the background of every night shift. She pushed her medication cart past room 312, 314, 316, the wheels squeaking slightly on the left side. She had been meaning to oil them for 3 weeks now, but there was always something more urgent, always another task that couldn't wait. Room 318. Marcus Peterson. Sarah paused outside his door, pulling up his chart on the tablet attached to her cart. Admitted 23 days ago with a diabetic foot ulcer that refused to heal. Type 2 diabetes, poorly controlled for years, but he'd been trying. He really had been. She'd seen his meal logs, watched him refuse the cookies his sister brought, saw the frustration in his eyes every time Dr. Chan examined the wound, and frowned. She knocked softly before entering. Marcus was awake, as he usually was at this hour. Chronic pain didn't respect sleep schedules. "Hey, Marcus," she said quietly, keeping her voice low enough not to disturb the patient in 318B. "How we doing tonight?" "Same as yesterday, Sarah. Same as the day before." His voice carried the particular weariness of someone who'd stopped expecting good news. At 62, Marcus looked older. The pain did that, carved lines into faces, bent backs that once stood straight. He'd been a Marine, served 2 tours before settling into a quiet life as a high school janitor. 30 years of mopping floors, fixing broken lockers, being invisible to everyone except for the few students who bothered to say hello. Sarah checked his vitals, made notes. Blood pressure slightly elevated, but given the pain, that was expected. She examined the wound dressing, seeing the telltale signs of, not quite infection, not quite healing, stuck in that terrible liminal space that shouldn't exist with proper treatment. Dr. Chen says if it doesn't start improving soon, they might need to talk about more aggressive intervention, Marcus said, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. He didn't say amputation, but they both knew what aggressive intervention meant. "Let's not go there yet," Sarah said, trying to inject optimism she didn't quite feel. "You're on strong antibiotics. The wound care protocol is solid. Sometimes these things just take time." But even as she said it, something nagged at her. 23 days on IV antibiotics, vancomycin, the good stuff, and no improvement? She'd seen diabetic ulcers before, plenty of them. They were stubborn, yes, but with proper treatment, there should be some progress by now. She finished her checks, marked his chart, and moved on to her other patients. Room 320, Mrs. Chen with pneumonia, improving, thank God. Room 322, Mr. Rodriguez, post-op from hip replacement, doing well, probably discharge in 2 days. Room 324, young woman with appendectomy, sleeping peacefully. The rest of the floor was quiet. Night shift at Memorial was usually manageable. This wasn't the ER or ICU where chaos reigned. This was the medical floor, where people came to heal slowly, where the drama was usually limited to medication schedules and morning rounds. Sarah returned to the nurse's station, where Linda Park sat typing notes into the computer system. Linda was 29, had been at Memorial for just over a year, and was everything Sarah had thought she'd be when she first became a nurse. Energetic, optimistic, always volunteering for extra shifts, always first to help. Her scrubs were always pressed, her hair always perfect in its ponytail, her smile always ready. Sarah had been that person once, before her husband left, before she was raising Mia alone on a nurse's salary, before the reality of healthcare wore down her edges. "All quiet?" Linda asked, looking up with that perpetual brightness. "Marcus in 318 is still struggling," Sarah said, settling into the chair beside her. "I'm worried about him." "Oh, I know," Linda said, genuine concern in her voice. "Poor guy. I keep hoping we'll see some improvement soon." They worked in companionable silence for a while, charting notes, reviewing the next round of medications due at 4 a.m. This was the rhythm of night shift. Long stretches of quiet, broken by occasional urgency, a kind of meditation punctuated by crisis. At 3:15 a.m., Sarah stood to make her rounds again. She passed the medication room, a small secured space where controlled substances were kept under double lock. Through the small window in the door, she could see Linda inside, preparing medications for her assigned patients. Nothing unusual about that. Nurses went in and out of the medication room dozens of times per shift. But something made Sarah pause. Some instinct honed by 8 years of night shifts, of learning to read the tiny deviations from normal that signaled problems. Linda's body language was slightly off. Her shoulders hunched in a way that suggested, what? Concentration or concealment? Sarah shook her head. Paranoia. This was what happened when you worked too many nights, when the fluorescent lights in the quiet corridors played tricks on your mind. Linda was fine. Linda was perfect, probably too perfect, but that wasn't a crime. She continued her rounds, checking on Marcus again. Still awake, still in pain, still deteriorating in that slow, grinding way that was almost worse than acute crisis. "Can't sleep?" Sarah asked unnecessarily. "Foot's throbbing," he said. "And I keep thinking, if I lose it, Sarah, how do I work? I'm not exactly white-collar material. Everything I know how to do requires standing, walking, moving around. I've got 7 more years until Social Security, and my savings aren't—" He trailed off. "I know that calculation. I do it myself every month. Rent, groceries, Mia's school expenses, car payment, medical insurance that doesn't cover enough. The math that never quite works, the constant juggling of which bill can wait another week." "We're not there yet," Sarah said firmly. "The antibiotics are working." But even as she said it, she wondered if that was true. She left him and returned to the nurse's station, pulling up Marcus's full medical record on her computer. 8 years of nursing had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now her instincts were screaming that something was wrong. She traced through his treatment history. Admitted with a grade 3 diabetic ulcer, started on standard wound care and oral antibiotics. After 5 days with no improvement, switched to IV vancomycin. Dosage 1,500 milligrams every 12 hours, adjusted for his renal function. Sarah pulled up the medication administration record, every dose logged, every administration signed off. She cross-referenced with the pharmacy records, every dose prepared, every dose delivered. Everything looked perfect on paper, but Marcus wasn't getting better. What Sarah didn't know yet was that perfection on paper often hides the ugliest truths, and in the next 72 hours, she would discover that the greatest betrayals don't come from strangers. They come from the people you trust to do the right thing.
The next night, Sarah arrived for her shift with a hyper-awareness she couldn't quite explain to herself. She'd spent her day off thinking about Marcus, about the math that didn't add up, about the perfect records that yielded imperfect results. During handoff, the day shift nurse mentioned that Dr. Chen had ordered additional imaging for Marcus. He's frustrated, the nurse said. Can't figure out why the antibiotics aren't working. Starting to think maybe it's an antibiotic resistance strain. Sarah nodded, taking notes, but something in her gut twisted. Antibiotic-resistant infections happened, sure, but vancomycin was strong. If Marcus had MRSA or something similar, there'd be other signs: fever, elevated white blood cell count, more dramatic inflammation. Instead, he was just not healing. Like the treatment wasn't happening at all. She began her rounds at 11 p.m., checking each patient with her usual thoroughness. But tonight, part of her attention was always on the medication room, on Linda's movements, on the rhythm of the floor. At midnight, Linda went to the medication room to prepare the meds for the midnight administration round. Sarah waited 5 minutes, then found an excuse to need supplies from the storage closet adjacent to the medication room. The walls between were thin. This part of the hospital was old, built in the 70s before modern standards. Through the wall, Sarah could hear the soft sounds of Linda moving around. Normal sounds: cabinets opening, the click of syringes being prepared, the rustle of packaging. Sarah felt foolish. What was she doing? Spying on a colleague based on nothing but a feeling? But then she heard something else. A drawer opening. The controlled substance drawer, which required biometric access and had to be logged. Then another sound, subtle but distinct, the snap of a syringe being disconnected from a vial. Then another snap. And another. Sarah frowned. Why would Linda need multiple syringes for one patient's medications? She left the storage closet and returned to the nurse's station, pulling up the medication administration system. Linda had logged access to the controlled substance drawer for one patient, room 316, post-surgical patient requiring pain management. One access, one patient, one medication. That Sarah had heard multiple syringes being prepared. Her heart began to beat faster. There could be innocent explanations. Maybe Linda was preparing medications for multiple patients at once, planning ahead. Maybe she dropped a syringe and needed to prepare a replacement. Maybe Sarah had simply miscounted the sounds. Or maybe not. She waited until Linda emerged from the medication room, cart loaded with prepared medications. She watched as Linda made her rounds efficiently, professionally, perfectly. Nothing out of place, nothing suspicious. Except that when Linda reached Marcus's room, she was in there for less than 2 minutes. IV medication administration should take longer. Checking the IV line, administering the medication slowly to avoid adverse reactions, monitoring for immediate issues. 2 minutes wasn't enough time. Sarah's hands felt cold. She stood up, walking casually down the hallway, timing it so she'd pass Marcus's room just as Linda was exiting. All good? Sarah asked. Yep, gave him his vancomycin. Poor guy's struggling tonight. I hope Dr. Chen's new imaging shows something useful. Sarah smiled and nodded, but as Linda walked away, Sarah slipped into Marcus's room. He was settling back into his pillows, eyes half closed. The IV bag hanging beside his bed was labeled correctly. Vancomycin, 1,500 milligrams and 250 milliliters normal saline. The rate was set correctly. Everything looked right. How are you feeling, Marcus? Sarah asked softly. Tired, he murmured. That antibiotic always makes me sleepy. But vancomycin didn't cause drowsiness. It wasn't a side effect of the medication. Sarah had checked. She had been reviewing Marcus's reactions to his medications obsessively for the past 24 hours. He'd never mentioned drowsiness before. Unless he wasn't getting vancomycin. Sarah's breath caught. She looked at the IV bag again, at the clear fluid running through the line into Marcus's arm. It looked right. But looking right and being right weren't the same thing. She forced herself to stay calm. Get some rest, she told Marcus, and left the room. Back at the nurse's station, Sarah sat down and tried to think clearly. If her suspicion was correct, if Linda was somehow diverting Marcus's antibiotics, then what? What could Linda possibly gain from that? Vancomycin itself was cheap, pennies per dose when manufactured in bulk.
But then she searched differently. She looked up medication diversion patterns, theft schemes in healthcare settings. And there it was. Nurses stealing expensive IV antibiotics and replacing them with saline solution, then selling the real medications to individuals or facilities without proper pharmaceutical channels. Veterinary clinics, overseas buyers, people who needed medications but couldn't afford them through legitimate means. The profit margin wasn't huge, but for someone desperate for money, it could be significant. A single vial of vancomycin could be sold for $50 to $70 on the gray market. Marcus was supposed to receive 2 doses per day. That was $140 per day, nearly $1,000 a week just from one patient. And Linda had access to multiple patients receiving IV antibiotics, not just Marcus, but 2 others on the floor. Sarah's hand shook as she closed her browser. This was serious. This was patient endangerment, theft, potentially criminal prosecution. This could destroy Linda's career, maybe even result in jail time. But Sarah didn't have proof. She had a suspicion, a gut feeling, some sounds through a wall, and a patient who wasn't healing as expected. None of that would hold up to scrutiny. She'd sound paranoid, vindictive even. The crazy night shift nurse making accusations against the beloved, perfect Linda. She needed evidence.
Over the next 2 nights, Sarah watched. She paid attention to every detail, every movement, every inconsistency. She noticed that Linda always volunteered to handle the IV antibiotic administrations. She noticed that Linda always went to the medication room alone, even when hospital protocol suggested having a witness for controlled substances. She noticed that the patients receiving IV antibiotics from Linda, not just Marcus, but 2 others on the floor, weren't improving as quickly as expected. And she noticed something else. Linda was always tired lately. Not the normal fatigue of night shift work, but a deeper exhaustion that showed in the shadows under her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped when she thought no one was watching, the tremor in her hands when she typed. On the 4th night, Sarah made her decision. She had to know for certain. At 1:30 a.m., she told Linda she was taking her break. Instead, she went to the supply closet next to the medication room and waited. At 2 a.m., like clockwork, Linda entered the medication room for the 2 a.m. medication round. Sarah positioned herself where she could see through the small window in the medication room door. The angle was poor, but she could see Linda's reflection in the glass cabinet doors. Linda accessed the controlled substance drawer. Sarah could hear the biometric lock disengage. She watched Linda pull out a vial of vancomycin, then prepare a syringe. Standard procedure. But then Linda did something that made Sarah's blood run cold. Linda drew up the vancomycin from the vial into the syringe. Then she took out a second, empty vial from her pocket, a vial she'd brought with her, not from the hospital supply. She transferred the vancomycin from the hospital syringe into her personal vial. Then she filled the hospital syringe with saline solution from a normal IV bag. The entire switch took less than 30 seconds. If you weren't watching carefully, you'd never notice. The syringe looked the same. Clear liquid, proper volume, correct labeling still attached. Sarah backed away from the window, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She'd just witnessed a crime. She had just watched a nurse deliberately endanger a patient's life. She should report this immediately. Call security, call the nursing supervisor, call the police. This was cut and dry, black and white, no ambiguity. But something made her pause. Sarah had learned long ago that the right thing to do and the easy thing to do are rarely the same. But she hadn't yet learned that sometimes the right thing to do isn't clear at all, and the cost of righteousness might be higher than she could afford to pay.
Sarah didn't sleep when she got home that morning. She sat at her kitchen table, watching the sunrise through her window, her coffee growing cold in front of her, her mind racing through scenarios and consequences and choices. Mia came out for breakfast at 7, already dressed in her school uniform,
12 years old, growing up so fast, always understanding when Sarah was too tired to make a proper dinner, always patient when Sarah fell asleep during movie nights, always mature beyond her years, because that's what happened when your mom was a single parent working night shifts. "You okay, Mom?" Mia asked, pouring herself cereal. "Just tired, honey," Sarah said, forcing a smile. "Rough night." "You always say that," Mia said, but she smiled back. "I've got that field trip next week, remember? The Science Museum? I need $40 for admission and lunch." $40. Sarah did the mental calculation automatically. She had about $200 in checking until her next paycheck in 5 days. Rent was paid, thank God, but she needed gas money, groceries, and Mia's prescription allergy medication that insurance only partially covered came to $70. "I'll have it for you by Monday," Sarah said. She'd skip lunch at work, bring leftovers instead of buying anything. She'd make it work. She always made it work. After Mia left for school, Sarah finally allowed herself to think about Linda. She needed more information before deciding what to do. She needed context, needed to understand the full picture. She opened her laptop and started searching. First, she looked up Linda's public social media profiles. The usual pictures, smiling selfies with friends, beach vacations, inspirational quotes about nursing and caring. Nothing unusual. But then she dug deeper, using the same database access she had for verifying patient information. It wasn't technically allowed to look up colleagues, but Sarah rationalized that this was a safety issue. Linda Park, 29, lived alone in her apartment across town. No criminal record, clean driving record, good credit score until about 8 months ago when she'd suddenly maxed out 3 credit cards and taken out a personal loan. She frowned. What had happened 8 months ago? She searched further, using a People search database. Linda's parents were listed. Father deceased 3 years ago, mother living in Portland. Sarah found an obituary for the father. And then she found something else. News articles from 6 months ago about experimental cancer treatments, insurance denials, crowdfunding campaigns. Linda's mother had stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The insurance company had denied coverage for an experimental treatment that might extend her life. The treatment cost $40,000 per month. Linda had started a GoFundMe that raised $8,000. Nowhere near enough. Sarah sat back, her chest tight. She knew that desperation. She'd felt it herself when Mia had needed emergency dental surgery that insurance classified as cosmetic because it wasn't immediately life-threatening. She had felt it when choosing between paying rent and paying for Mia's school supplies. She'd felt it every single time she had looked at her bank account and tried to make impossible math work. Linda was stealing antibiotics to sell them to pay for her mother's cancer treatment. The crime was still a crime. Patients were still being harmed. Marcus might still lose his foot, might lose his ability to work, might lose everything because Linda needed money for her mother. But God, Sarah understood the why. She showered and tried to sleep but couldn't. At 3 p.m., she gave up and drove to the hospital early. She needed to talk to Linda, needed to confront her, needed to hear the truth directly before deciding what to do. She found Linda in the break room at 4 p.m., eating a sandwich before the shift started. Linda looked up and smiled when Sarah entered. "Hey, you're here early." "Couldn't sleep," Sarah said. "Linda, can we talk privately?" Something in Sarah's tone made Linda's smile falter. "Sure. What's up?" They walked to an empty patient room, one being prepared for a new admission but currently vacant. Sarah closed the door and faced Linda directly. "I know what you're doing," Sarah said quietly. Linda's face went blank. "What do you mean?" "The antibiotics. I saw you last night in the medication room. I saw you swap out Marcus's vancomycin for saline." For a moment, Linda just stared at her. Then her face crumpled and tears started streaming down her cheeks. "Please," Linda whispered, "please don't report me. I can explain." "Your mother? Stage 4 pancreatic cancer? Experimental treatment not covered by insurance?" Linda's tears came harder. "She's all I have left, Sarah. My dad died 3 years ago. I don't have siblings, and she's only 56. The treatment is working. Her tumors are shrinking. She's got a chance. But it costs so much and insurance won't help, and I've sold everything I owned. I've borrowed from everyone I know, and it's still not enough."
So you're stealing antibiotics and selling them, Sarah said, trying to keep her voice neutral, non-judgmental.
I'm not selling to drug dealers or anything like that, Linda said desperately. There's a network, medical professionals who have been priced out of the system, veterinarians who can't afford pharmaceutical prices, people buying medications for family members overseas where these drugs cost 10 times as much. I'm helping people who need help. While hurting Marcus, Sarah said, while hurting Mrs. Davidson in 332, while endangering people who trusted us to care for them. I thought, Linda's voice broke, I thought they'd be okay. I thought a few extra days of healing wouldn't matter that much, that they'd eventually get better anyway. I didn't think, you didn't think Marcus might lose his foot? Sarah's voice rose despite her attempt at control. You didn't think about what that means for him? He's 62, Linda. He's got 7 years until retirement, no savings, and he works a physical job. If he loses that foot, he loses everything. I know, Linda was sobbing now. I know, and I hate myself for it, but what was I supposed to do? Let my mother die when I could save her? How is that better? How is that more ethical? Sarah had no answer, because the terrible truth was she understood. If it had been Mia dying, if there had been a treatment that could save her daughter's life, but insurance wouldn't cover it, what wouldn't Sarah do? What line wouldn't she cross? How much do you need? Sarah asked. Linda looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. What? For your mother's treatment, how much more do you need? Another 3 months of treatment, maybe 4. The doctors think that might be enough to get her into remission, or at least stable enough to qualify for a clinical trial. That's about $120,000. The number was astronomical, impossible. You can't keep doing this, Sarah said. You know that, right? Eventually someone else will notice. Eventually a patient will die. And then it won't just be your career, it'll be criminal charges, maybe manslaughter. I know, Linda whispered. I know, and I hate myself for it, but what was I supposed to do? Let my mother die when I could save her? How is that better? How is that more ethical? Sarah had no answer, because the terrible truth was she understood. If it had been Mia dying, if there had been a treatment that could save her daughter's life but insurance wouldn't cover it, what wouldn't Sarah do? What line wouldn't she cross? How much do you need? Sarah asked. Linda looked up, hope flickering in her eyes. What? For your mother's treatment, how much more do you need? Another 3 months of treatment, maybe 4. The doctors think that might be enough to get her into remission or at least stable enough to qualify for a clinical trial. That's about $120,000. The number was astronomical. Impossible. You can't keep doing this, Sarah said. You know that, right? Eventually someone else will notice. Eventually a patient will die. I know, Linda whispered. I know, and I hate myself for it, but what was I supposed to do? Let my mother die when I could save her? How is that better? How is that more ethical? 2 more weeks, Linda said desperately. I beg you, just 2 more weeks, just enough to get Mom through her next treatment cycle. After that, I'll turn myself in. I'll confess everything. I'll face whatever consequences come. Just 2 more weeks. Sarah shook her head. 2 more weeks of Marcus not getting his antibiotics? 2 more weeks of his condition deteriorating? 2 more weeks closer to amputation? I'll stop with Marcus, Linda said desperately. I'll stop with all the current patients. I'll only take from new admissions, people who just started treatment, people where a few days' delay won't matter as much. Please, Sarah, I'm begging you. Sarah looked at Linda's tear-stained face and saw desperation, saw fear for love of her mother mixed with shame for her choices. She saw herself in Linda, saw every single parent who'd ever had to choose between rent and food, every person who'd ever looked at medical bills and felt their hearts sink. Every human being crushed under the weight of a healthcare system that valued profit over life. I need to think, Sarah said. I need to... She left the room without finishing her sentence. She walked through the hospital corridors, past doctors making rounds, past families visiting patients, past the everyday machinery of healthcare that worked so well for some people and failed so catastrophically for others. In her car, Sarah sat with her hands on the steering wheel and allowed herself to cry. Because there was no good answer here. Report Linda, and a mother dies while Linda goes to prison, and the system grinds on unchanged. Don't report Linda, and Sarah becomes complicit in patient endangerment. And maybe Marcus loses his foot, and maybe someone dies. And the system still grinds on unchanged.
The hardest truths we face aren't about right and wrong. They're about choosing which consequences we can live with. And Sarah was about to discover that some choices don't just change lives, they reshape who we are at our core.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah called in sick for her next shift. She needed time, needed space, needed to think, without the pressure of Linda working beside her, without Marcus's deteriorating conditions staring her in the face. She spent the day researching. She looked up the Nurse Practice Act, the legal obligations of mandatory reporting, the penalties for failing to report patient endangerment. She looked at the success rates of Linda's mother's experimental treatment. 70% showed significant improvement, 40% achieved remission. Real hope, not false promises. She looked at the average cost of prosthetic limbs, the rehabilitation process for below-knee amputation, the employment statistics for manual laborers who'd lost limbs. The numbers were grim. She looked up the prison sentences for medical theft, for patient endangerment, for fraud. Linda would likely serve 5 to 10 years. Her mother would die during that time. The medication would be lost anyway, destroying it or returning it to the pharmaceutical company rather than letting it help someone who needed it. Sarah thought about justice, about rules, about the difference between law and morality. She thought about the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. But which harm? The harm to Marcus? The harm to Linda's mother? The harm to Linda herself? All paths led to someone getting hurt. On her second day off, Mia came home from school excited about her upcoming field trip. Sarah handed her $50. She'd found an extra $10 by skipping groceries this week, eating ramen and cereal instead of proper meals. "Mom, you look tired," Mia said, concerned. "Like, really tired." "Just work stuff, honey," Sarah said. "Nothing you need to worry about." But that night, after Mia was asleep, Sarah sat at her computer and made a decision. She couldn't live with doing nothing, but she also couldn't live with the black and white righteousness of simply reporting Linda and washing her hands of the consequences. So she chose a third path. She opened her banking app and looked at her savings account. $3,200. That was supposed to be her emergency fund, the cushion between stability and disaster, the thing that would save her if her car broke down or Mia got sick or the apartment needed repairs. She transferred $2,000 to Linda's mother's treatment fund. Then she opened her retirement account, the 401k she'd been contributing to for 8 years. $23,000. Not nearly enough for actual retirement, but something. She initiated an early withdrawal of $20,000, knowing she'd pay penalties and taxes that would reduce it to about $15,000. $17,000 total. Nowhere near the $120,000 Linda needed, but enough to buy time. Enough to pay for maybe 6 more weeks of treatment. Then Sarah started making phone calls. She called the local news station's investigative reporting unit. She called her state representative's office. She called patient advocacy groups and healthcare reform organizations. She explained in general terms, without naming Linda or Marcus, the impossible choice she'd witnessed. A nurse forced to choose between her mother's life and her patient's well-being because the healthcare system had failed them both. She told the story of a veteran facing amputation because he couldn't afford the insulin that would have prevented his diabetes from becoming severe in the first place. She told the story of a cancer patient denied life-saving treatment because insurance classified it as experimental despite its proven success rate. She told the story of nurses and doctors working within a system that forced them to choose between their ethics and their families. Some people listened. Most didn't. But Sarah planted seeds, started conversations, made noise. And then she went back to work. Linda was standing at the nurse's station when Sarah arrived for her shift. Their eyes met, and Linda's face crumpled with relief. "Can we talk?" Sarah asked. They went to the same empty patient room. Sarah closed the door and pulled out her phone, showing Linda the bank transfer confirmations. "I've given you $17,000. That's about 6 weeks of treatment for your mother." Linda stared at the screen and her mouth open in shock. "Sarah, you can't." "I already did," Sarah said. "But here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop stealing medications immediately. Not in 2 weeks, not tomorrow, right now, tonight, this ends. You're going to give Marcus his real vancomycin, you're going to give all your patients their real medications, and you're going to pray that you haven't done permanent damage." "But my mother!" "You're also going to apply for every patient assistance program that exists for her treatment. The pharmaceutical company that makes the drug has a compassionate use program. I looked it up.
The approval process takes 4 to 6 weeks, which is exactly how long my money will cover. You're going to fill out those forms tonight, during our break, and I'm going to help you." Linda was crying again. "Why would you do this? Why would you help me after what I did?" I thought about that question. Because you are right about one thing. The system is broken. It shouldn't cost $120,000 to save someone's life. Insurance companies shouldn't get to decide who lives and who dies based on profit margins. But you are wrong about something too. We don't fix a broken system by breaking ourselves. We don't heal the world by hurting the people who trust us. "I don't deserve this," Linda whispered. "Maybe not," Sarah agreed. "But your mother deserves a chance, and Marcus deserves his medication, and I deserve to look at myself in the mirror and know I did everything I could to make this right." "What about reporting me? Your legal obligation?" "I thought about this carefully. I'm going to give you a choice. If at the end of 6 weeks, your mother's accepted into a compassionate use program or a clinical trial, you're going to resign from Memorial. You're going to leave nursing, find another career, and you're never going to put yourself in a position where you could hurt patients again. But I won't report what happened. I'll let you move on with your life." "And if she rejects her?" "Then we'll face that when it comes. But Linda, if I ever find out you've stolen medication again, if I ever hear that you've endangered a patient again, I will report everything. I will testify against you. I will make sure you face every consequence. This is your one chance. Don't waste it." Linda nodded, tears streaming down her face. Thank you, Sarah. I don't know how." "Start by going to the medication room right now and preparing Marcus's real vancomycin. That's how you thank me. By fixing what you broke." They worked their shift in careful coordination. Sarah watched as Linda administered proper medications to all her patients. She watched the immediate relief on Marcus's face when he got real pain medication for the first time in weeks. She watched the color start to return to his complexion as his body finally received the antibiotics it desperately needed. Over the next 6 weeks, Sarah became intimately familiar with the bureaucracy of pharmaceutical assistance programs. She spent her breaks helping Linda fill out forms, gather documentation, write appeals when they were initially denied. She made phone calls to social workers, patient advocates, and healthcare reform organizations. She also watched her bank account dwindle to nothing. The emergency fund was gone. The retirement account was gone. She had $17 in checking, and payday was still 4 days away. When Mia needed new shoes, she had to ask for an advance on her paycheck. When the car needed oil change, she had to choose between that or eating lunch. She learned what poverty felt like, not the abstract concept she had understood intellectually, but the daily grinding reality of choosing between gas money and eating lunch, of checking price tags on everything, of constant anxiety about the next unexpected expense. But she also watched Marcus's foot begin to heal, slowly at first, then more dramatically. Dr. Chen was amazed at the turnaround, attributing it to the new imaging that had led to a refined treatment approach. Sarah and Linda exchanged glances and said nothing. 6 weeks after their confrontation, Linda received the acceptance letter from the pharmaceutical company's compassionate use program. Her mother would receive the treatment at no cost for up to 1 year, with the possibility of extension or transition to a clinical trial afterward. Linda handed Sarah an envelope the next night. Inside was a handwritten letter of resignation and a check for $17,000. "I can't take this," Sarah said, pushing the check back. "Your mother needs." "The program covers everything," Linda said. "Mom doesn't need this money anymore, but you do. And Sarah, I can never repay what you did, but at least let me give back what you gave." Sarah took the check with shaking hands. $17,000. Her emergency fund restored, her retirement account replenished, her breathing room returned. "I'm leaving at the end of the month," Linda said quietly. "I'm going back to school for medical coding. Still medication, but behind a desk, away from direct patient care, away from temptation." "I know, that's the right choice," Sarah said. "Is it?" Linda asked. "I'm a good nurse. I really am. Or I was, before I started stealing. I'm good at patient care, good at connecting with people, good at the job. Now I'm walking away from a career I love because I made terrible choices." "You're walking away because you learn that loving something isn't enough if you can't do it ethically. That's not failure, Linda. That's growth." They finished their shift in silence, the weight of everything that had happened settling between them. When Linda left Memorial Hospital for the last time 3 weeks later, she hugged Sarah tightly in the parking lot. "You saved 2 lives," Linda whispered. "My mother's and mine. I'll never forget that." Sarah walked her drive away and wondered if she'd done the right thing. She'd broken rules, compromised her integrity, risked her license and her career. She'd chosen compassion over protocol, mercy over justice. And she'd sleep tonight, which was more than she could say for the alternative. But the story doesn't end with one problem solved and one choice made, because real life isn't that neat. Real life has consequences that ripple outward in ways we never anticipate. And Sarah was about to learn that the hardest part of doing the right thing isn't making the decision, it's living with what comes after.
Marcus was discharged 6 weeks after Linda's resignation. His wound had healed completely, the tissue pink and healthy, no sign of the infection that had threatened his livelihood. Dr. Chen called it a remarkable recovery, attributing it to persistence and finally finding the right treatment approach. Sarah was in the room when Marcus got his discharge papers. He was dressed in street clothes for the first time in 2 months, sitting on the edge of the bed with his shoes on, both shoes, on both feet, looking 10 years younger than he had when she first met him. "I'm going back to work next week," he told Sarah. "Got medical clearance and everything. Principal says they held my position for me." He paused, then looked at her with knowing eyes. "Something happened, didn't it? Something changed in my treatment." Sarah kept her face neutral. "Dr. Chen adjusted your protocol based on the imaging results." "Right," Marcus said slowly. "Except the imaging didn't show anything different, did it? I asked to see it. Same infection, same wound pattern, same everything. But suddenly I started getting better." Sarah said nothing. "I'm not asking you to tell me what happened. I just want you to know that I know someone did something. And whoever that was, they saved my life. My real life. Not just my foot. They saved my job, my independence, my future." His eyes were bright with unshed tears. "So if you know who that person is, tell them thank you from me. Tell them it mattered." After he left, Sarah sat in the empty room for a long time. She thought about the ripple effects of choices, how one decision split reality into different paths. In one version, she'd reported Linda immediately, and Marcus had gotten proper treatment sooner. But Linda's mother would have died, and Linda would be imprisoned, and the system would have ground on unchanged. In another version, she'd done nothing, and Marcus might have lost his foot while Linda continued stealing and eventually got caught anyway. The path she'd chosen wasn't clean, it wasn't simple, but Marcus was walking out of the hospital on both feet, and Linda's mother was in remission, and Linda was building a new career, and maybe, just maybe, the conversations Sarah had started with reporters and advocates would lead to some small change in how the system worked. Or maybe not. Maybe she just temporarily patched a crack in a fundamentally broken foundation. But temporary help was still help. Imperfect solutions were still solutions. Sarah went home that morning to find Mia making breakfast. Scrambled eggs and toast, the edges only slightly burned. "Surprise," Mia said. "I know you've been stressed about money lately, so I used my allowance to buy groceries. We've got eggs and bread and peanut butter and—" "Mom, are you crying?" Sarah was crying. She pulled Mia into a hug, holding her daughter tight, feeling the solid reality of this 12-year-old person who somehow understood sacrifice and love and responsibility far too young. "I'm just tired, baby. Happy tired." The $17,000 Linda had returned was sitting in Sarah's bank account, a buffer between her and catastrophe. She'd already decided what to do with some of it: restart her retirement contributions, rebuild the emergency fund, maybe take Mia on a real vacation for the first time in 3 years. But first, she was going to sleep for 12 uninterrupted hours. 2 months after Linda left, Sarah received a letter forwarded from the hospital's patient advocacy office. It was from Marcus. "Dear Sarah, I'm writing this letter because I need you to understand what you and everyone at Memorial Hospital did for me. The doctor saved my foot, but you saved my life in a different way. Every night during those weeks when I wasn't healing, when the pain wouldn't stop and the doctors couldn't figure out why, I'd lay awake thinking about what it would mean to lose my foot. I'd imagine trying to work with a prosthetic, imagine the rehabilitation,
Imagine being 62 years old, with 7 years until retirement, and no way to do my job. I'd imagine losing my apartment because I couldn't work. Imagine being homeless at my age. Imagine becoming one of those veterans you see on street corners with cardboard signs. That's where my mind went. To the worst possible outcomes, because I've seen it happen to other guys like me. One setback, one health crisis, and suddenly you're falling through every safety net society supposedly provides. But then something changed. I don't know what, and I suspect I'm not supposed to know what, but I started healing, and that healing saved more than my foot. It saved my future, my dignity, my sense of purpose. I'm back at work now. I spent yesterday mopping the gym floor after a basketball game, fixing a broken locker, helping a kid pick up dropped books in the hallway. Small things, invisible things, the kind of work that people don't notice unless it doesn't get done. But it matters. I matter, and someone made sure I'd keep mattering. So thank you. Thank you to whoever made whatever choice they made that gave me my life back. I hope they know it was worth it. Sincerely, Marcus Peterson. Sarah folded the letter carefully and put it in her drawer at home next to Mia's school photos and the Mother's Day card Mia had made her last year. That night at work, Sarah took her break in the empty patient room where she had confronted Linda months ago. She sat in the chair where Linda had cried, where they'd made their impossible deal, where Sarah had chosen to break the rules in service of something larger than rules. She thought about justice versus mercy, about right versus good, about the difference between legal and moral. She thought about the nursing oath she had taken 8 years ago, about doing no harm, about being patient advocates. She thought about Linda, now working from home, doing medical coding, visiting her mother every weekend, rebuilding a life that had almost been destroyed by desperation and love. She thought about Marcus, mopping floors and fixing lockers and being invisible but essential. She thought about Mia, growing up watching her mother navigate impossible choices with grace and courage. And she thought about herself, not the idealistic young nurse who'd graduated full of certainty and conviction, but the woman she'd become, shaped by night shifts and financial stress and moral ambiguity. She was tired. God, she was tired. Tired of the fluorescent lights and the squeaking medication cart and the constant calculations of how to make impossible math work. Tired of a healthcare system that forced good people to make terrible choices. Tired of being strong and stoic and eternally professional when what she wanted to do is scream at the unfairness of it all. But she was also proud. Proud that when faced with an impossible choice, she'd found a third option. Proud that she was willing to sacrifice her financial security to do what she thought was right. Proud that she had held Linda accountable while also showing her mercy. It hadn't been perfect. Nothing ever was. But it had been human, which was sometimes more important than perfect.
3 months after Marcus's discharge, Sarah received a call from one of the patient advocacy organizations she'd contacted. They wanted to interview her for a documentary about healthcare workers facing ethical dilemmas in a broken system. They promised anonymity, promised to protect her identity, but wanted to tell the story. Not Linda's specific case, but the broader issue of healthcare professionals caught between protocol and compassion. Sarah agreed. The interview took place in a nondescript office, Sarah sitting in a chair with the camera positioned so only her hands were visible. She told the story in broad strokes. A nurse who stole to save her mother, a patient who suffered because of it, a colleague who had to decide what to do. "What did you do?" the interviewer asked. "I broke the rules," Sarah said simply. "I didn't follow protocol. I didn't immediately report what I'd witnessed. Instead, I tried to find a solution that would stop the harm while also addressing the desperation that had caused it in the first place." "Do you think you made the right choice?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "I think I made the most human choice. Whether it was right, I guess that depends on your definition of right. The patient recovered. The nurse's mother survived. The nurse left the profession before she could hurt anyone else. Nobody died, nobody went to prison, and 2 families stayed intact. But you broke the law. You failed to report a crime. You could have lost your license." "Yes," Sarah acknowledged. "I could have.
But I'd rather lose my license trying to do good than keep it by doing nothing except following rules that don't account for human complexity. What would you say to other healthcare workers facing similar dilemmas? Sarah looked directly at the camera, even though her face wouldn't be visible in the final documentary. I'd say that you entered this profession to help people. Sometimes helping people means following the rules. Sometimes it means knowing when the rules fail to account for reality. You have to live with your choices, so make the choices you can live with. Make the choices that let you look at yourself in the mirror. Make the choices that honor the reason you became a nurse or a doctor or a caregiver in the first place. And what was your reason? The interviewer asked softly. Sarah smiled, thinking of Mia, of Marcus, of Linda's mother, of all the patients she'd cared for over 8 years of night shifts. Because someone has to give a damn. Because someone has to stand in the gap between the system and the people it fails. Because caring isn't just a feeling, it's an action, and sometimes that action is messy and complicated and breaks all the rules. The documentary aired 6 months later on a public television station. Sarah watched it with Mia, who was 13 now, suddenly taller and more grown up than seemed possible. Is this about you, Mom? What makes you think that? Because those are your hands, Mia said, pointing at the screen. I'd recognize them anywhere. You have that scar on your left thumb from when you accidentally cut yourself making my birthday cake 3 years ago. Sarah looked at her daughter and saw understanding in her eyes. Not the innocent understanding of a child, but the complex awareness of a young woman who'd grown up watching her mother struggle and sacrifice and choose compassion over convenience. Yeah, Sarah admitted. It's about me. Did you really break the rules to help people? Yes. Good, Mia said firmly. Rules are supposed to help people. If they don't, they're bad rules. Sarah laughed, pulling her daughter close. It's more complicated than that, honey. I know, Mia said, but it's also that simple. You helped people who needed help. That's what you always do. That's who you are. In the end, we're all just trying to do our best in a world that doesn't make it easy. Sarah's story could have ended in tragedy. Careers destroyed, lives ruined, the system unchanged. Instead, it became something else. A reminder that the most powerful force in healthcare isn't protocol or policy. It's human beings who refuse to accept that the way things are is the way they have to be.
1 year after Linda's resignation, Sarah received an invitation to speak at a nursing ethics conference. The documentary had sparked conversations in healthcare circles about the impossible positions that underpaid, overworked healthcare professionals were put in by a system that prioritized profit over care. Sarah almost declined. She wasn't a speaker, wasn't an activist, wasn't anyone special. She was just a night shift nurse at a medium-sized hospital who'd made one difficult choice. But then she thought about Marcus, about Linda, about every nurse and doctor she knew who'd faced similar dilemmas in silence. She thought about the conversations that needed to happen, the changes that needed to be made. She accepted. The conference was in Chicago, at a large hotel convention center. Hundreds of nurses, nursing students, and healthcare administrators filled the auditorium. Sarah stood backstage, her hands shaking, wondering what she could possibly say that would matter. When she walked onto the stage, she didn't have prepared remarks. She just told the truth. My name is Sarah Williams. I'm a night shift nurse at Memorial Hospital. I've been a nurse for 9 years now, and I love my job. I love helping people. I love the challenge of it. I love knowing that what I do matters. She paused, looking out at the sea of faces. But I hate what our system does to us. I hate that we're forced to choose between our ethics and our families. I hate that we're paid so little that one unexpected expense can devastate us financially. I hate that the people we care for often can't afford the medications they need, can't afford the treatments that would save their lives, can't afford to be healthy in the wealthiest country in the world. The audience was silent, attentive. A year ago, I discovered that a colleague was stealing antibiotics from patients to sell them so she could pay for her mother's cancer treatment. The patient she was stealing from was deteriorating, possibly facing amputation. I had a legal and ethical obligation to report her immediately. Sarah took a breath. But I didn't.
Instead, I gave her money from my retirement fund, money I couldn't afford to give, to buy time while we found a legitimate solution. And in those weeks, I learned something about healthcare that they don't teach in nursing school. She leaned forward, gripping the podium. They teach us about ethics. They teach us about legal obligations and professional standards and evidence-based care, but they don't teach us what to do when following the rules means someone dies. They don't teach us how to live with ourselves when we're forced to choose between two equally terrible options. The colleague I helped eventually got her mother accepted into a compassionate use program. She left nursing and found a new career. The patient recovered fully, nobody died, nobody went to prison, and I got my money back. By conventional standards, it worked out. But here's what else happened. I spent 6 weeks barely able to afford food. I had panic attacks every time my car made a strange noise because I couldn't afford repairs. I lied to my daughter about why we couldn't go to the movies or buy new school clothes. And I lived with the constant fear that I'd made the wrong choice, that my compassion had been misplaced, that I'd destroyed my career and my life for nothing. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. And you know what the worst part is? I'd do it again. Because that patient, Marcus, he's back at work. He's living his life. He's not homeless, not disabled, not fallen through the cracks of a system that fails people every single day. And that matters to me more than following rules that don't account for human complexity. She straightened up. But it shouldn't have come to that. It shouldn't require nurses giving up their retirement funds. It shouldn't require any of us making choices like this. So here's what I want to say to every nurse, every doctor, every healthcare worker in this room. Your compassion is not weakness. Your willingness to see the humanity in impossible situations is not naivety. And your frustration with a system that forces you to choose between your ethics and your survival is not unprofessional. But we have to be smarter than I was. We have to organize, advocate, and demand change at the systemic level. We have to stop accepting that this is just how healthcare works. We have to fight for a system where patients can afford their medications, where healthcare workers are paid enough to survive, where compassionate care doesn't require breaking the rules. Sarah's eyes swept across the audience. I broke the rules because I saw no other option. But we need to build a world where the rules themselves are compassionate, where the system itself cares about human beings more than profits, where doing the right thing and following the rules are the same thing. Until then, I'll keep working my night shifts. I'll keep caring for patients. I'll keep making impossible choices. But I'm not going to be quiet about it anymore. None of us should be. The applause started slowly, then built to a standing ovation. Sarah stood at the podium, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the response. After the speech, dozens of nurses approached her with their own stories. A pediatric nurse who'd given a mother her own medication samples because the child's prescription was too expensive. An ER doctor who'd listed a patient as unstable to keep them in the hospital longer because they were homeless and freezing temperatures were forecasted. A hospice nurse who'd broken protocol to stay overnight with the dying patient who had no family. Story after story of healthcare workers bending or breaking rules because the rules failed to account for human need. 3 months after the conference, Sarah received a letter from the American Nurses Association. They wanted to create a task force on ethical dilemmas in resource-limited healthcare settings, and they wanted Sarah to be part of it. She accepted. The task force met quarterly, bringing together nurses, ethicists, patient advocates, and policy experts. They documented cases, identified patterns, and began drafting policy recommendations. It was slow work, frustrating work, the kind of incremental change that felt insignificant compared to the scale of the problem. But it was something. It was action. It was refusing to accept that the system couldn't change. Sarah continued working her night shifts at Memorial. She still pushed the squeaky medication cart, still checked on patients at 2 a.m., still made impossible choices with insufficient resources. But now she also spent her days off writing policy briefs, giving interviews, and fighting for change. Mia was 15 now, applying to high schools, talking about maybe becoming a nurse herself someday. "I want to be like you," Mia said one evening over dinner. "A perpetually exhausted single mom with no social life?" Sarah asked with a smile.
Someone who helps people even when it's hard. Someone who does the right thing, even when the rules say not to. Someone who gives a damn. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. That's the best compliment anyone's ever given me. 2 years after the documentary aired, Sarah received an email from Linda. They'd stayed in loose contact, occasional messages, holiday cards, brief updates, but this email was different. Sarah, I wanted you to know that Mom is officially in remission. 2 years cancer-free as of last month. The doctors are amazed. We're amazed. It feels like a miracle, except I know it's not. It's pharmaceutical science and compassionate use programs, and most of all, it's you. You saved her life. You saved my life too, though not in the way you might think. Losing my nursing license, or rather, choosing to walk away before I lost it, was the best thing that ever happened to me. I'm good at medical coding, I'm successful at it, and I can do it without the temptation to make terrible choices under pressure. But more than that, what you did taught me something about being human that I'd forgotten. You could have destroyed me. You had every right to report me, to let the system grind me up and spit me out. Instead, you saw me, really saw me, all of me, the good and the bad and the desperate. You showed me that mercy isn't about letting people off the hook. It's about holding them accountable while also acknowledging their humanity. You made me face what I'd done, fix it, and build something better. That's a gift I can never repay. I heard about your advocacy work. I saw your speech at the nursing conference online. You're changing the system, Sarah. You're making it so that the next nurse facing an impossible choice might have better options than I did. Thank you for everything. Thank you for seeing me as a whole person instead of just a criminal. Thank you for believing that people can change. Thank you for being the kind of human being the world needs more of. With love and gratitude, Linda. Sarah read the email 3 times, then saved it in a folder labeled Reasons. On her next shift, Sarah checked in on the new patient in room 318, the same room where Marcus had stayed 2 years ago. The patient was a young woman with an infection following surgery, receiving IV antibiotics, expected to make a full recovery. Sarah administered the medication carefully, checking and double-checking that everything was correct. She thought about Marcus, about Linda, about all the paths not taken and choices not made. As she left the room, she passed by the nurse's station where a new night shift nurse, fresh out of school, eager and idealistic, was reviewing patient charts. It's overwhelming at first, Sarah said kindly, but you'll get the hang of it. I hope so. I just want to help people, you know? I want to make a difference. Sarah smiled. Then you will. Just remember, making a difference isn't always about following the rules perfectly. Sometimes it's about knowing when the rules fail and having the courage to do what's right anyway.
3 years after the documentary aired, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at the hospital. It was Marcus, looking healthy and vibrant, carrying a folder. I wanted to show you something, he said, pulling out a newspaper clipping. It was an article about a new program at the hospital, a patient medication assistance fund, established to help patients who couldn't afford their prescribed treatments. They're naming it after some anonymous donor, Marcus said, with a knowing smile. But I did some digging. The initial funding came from a nurses' collective that formed after some documentary about ethical dilemmas in healthcare. Sound familiar? Sarah looked at the article, her chest tight with emotion. The fund wasn't huge. It would help maybe 12 patients per year, but it was something. It was the system beginning, slowly, incrementally, to acknowledge its failures and adapt. There's more, Marcus continued. He pulled out another clipping, this one about a state bill that would require insurance companies to cover more experimental cancer treatments. Your advocacy work is cited in the legislative research. You're literally changing laws, Sarah. It's not just me, Sarah protested. It's hundreds of healthcare workers and patient advocates, and it started with you, Marcus interrupted gently. It started with one nurse who refused to accept that following the rules was more important than saving lives. Everything that's happening now, the policy changes, the assistance programs, the conversations about healthcare reform, it all traces back to that choice you made. Sarah thought about that night 3 years ago, standing in the medication room doorway, watching Linda swap antibiotics for saline. She thought about the choice she had faced. Report or don't report. Follow the rules or follow her conscience. I was terrified, Sarah admitted. I spent months convinced I'd made the wrong choice, that I destroyed my career for nothing, that I was just being naive and idealistic. Were you? Marcus asked. Sarah thought about Linda's mother in remission, about Marcus walking on both feet, about the task force changing policies, about the young nurses who would face ethical dilemmas with slightly better options than she had had. No, she said finally. I wasn't naive. I was human. And humanity, real, messy, complicated humanity, is what the system needs most. Marcus pulled out one more thing from his folder. A check for $5,000, made out to the Patient Medication Assistance Fund. This is for me. I've been saving it up, putting aside a little from each paycheck, because you saved my life, and I want to help someone else's. That's how this works, right? One person helps another, and then that person helps someone else. And slowly, incrementally, we build something better. Sarah took the check with shaking hands. Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Sarah, for seeing me as more than just a patient, for caring enough to break the rules when the rules were wrong, for being brave when being brave was terrifying. After Marcus left, Sarah sat in the break room with a cup of terrible coffee and thought about the journey from that night 3 years ago to this moment. She thought about Mia, now a high school senior, planning to study nursing in college. I want to be like you, Mom, she had said again just last week. I want to help people even when it's hard. She thought about Linda, thriving in her new career, her mother healthy and traveling and living a life that had almost been cut short. She thought about the hundreds of nurses who'd approached her after speeches, who'd sent her emails, who'd shared their own stories of impossible choices and moral courage. She thought about the system, still broken, still failing people, but slowly, incrementally changing because people like her refused to accept that broken was inevitable. Healthcare in America was still too expensive. Insurance companies still denied necessary treatments. Nurses were still underpaid and overworked. Patients still fell through the cracks. But now there was a medication assistance fund. Now there were policy changes being debated in state legislators. Now there were conversations happening about compassionate care and ethical complexity and the human cost of profit-driven medicine. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough until the entire system was rebuilt with humanity at its center. But it was more than there had been 3 years ago. And that mattered. Sarah finished her coffee and returned to the nurse's station. Another night shift, another round of medications, another opportunity to care for people in a broken system. But she didn't feel broken. She felt strong. She felt purposeful. She felt like she was part of something larger than herself, a movement of healthcare workers who refused to choose between their ethics and their compassion, who demanded better for their patients and themselves. The fluorescent light still hummed, the medication cart still squeaked, the night was still long and the pay was still insufficient, and the system was still grinding along with all its flaws. But Sarah Williams, night shift nurse at Memorial Hospital, was changing the world one choice at a time. And that, in the end, is what mattered most.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.